Hi, everybody. I'm Tiffany. I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Tiffany.
I want to start off by thanking Steve for asking me to speak tonight. It's always an honor and a privilege when I get the opportunity to suit up and show up and participate in my sobriety at the level of service. So when I was asked, I was very humbled and grateful for the opportunity. As I said, my name's Tiffany. I am an alcoholic. My sobriety date is March 20th of 2013. I have a sponsor. Her name is Tracy. She has a sponsor, and her sponsor has a sponsor. I have a home group. It's the backroom group at 5925 O'Brien Avenue. We meet on Saturday and Sundays at 9 and 10:30. And that's where I do my service work. I have a service position as the alternate GSR there. And I sponsor women in AA, and I take them through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, the way that it's outlined in the book, and the way that I was taken through it. And over the years of my sobriety, I've cultivated a relationship with the God of my understanding. And I always start off sharing my story that way because these are the indispensable things in my sobriety today that I need to always remain in action of if I want to continue to keep what I have today. I wake up every day with untreated alcoholism, and I need to treat all three legs of that three-legged stool. So I was born in Chicago, Illinois. I was born to drug-addicted parents, and early childhood was not very enjoyable for me. There was a lot of chaos and drama. There was a lot of abuse, and very early on at the age of 4, we were taken out of the home and put into state custody. And for the next 5 years, my siblings and I bounced in and out of foster care. Just from that early age, I remember feeling such a level of abandonment and not being lovable, not being wanted, and I didn't understand as a small child growing up why things were happening to me and why nobody wanted to keep me or love me. At the age of 10, I was adopted out of the system. Me and my brother were. And I remember it very clearly. We were walking to school. In Chicago, you walk to school. It's only like 3-4 blocks to get to elementary school. And the other kids were talking about everything they had gotten for Christmas. We had just come back from Christmas break. And they were talking about all the toys they had gotten. And while I had gotten toys, I just remember looking at my neighbor and saying, I got a family. And at the age of 10, that was the first time that I really had a mom and dad and a new last name. And that was pretty big for me. So from that point forward, life went on, I didn't understand that the fact that I wasn't being, physically abused, that, you couldn't be abused in other ways as far as like mental and emotional abuse. My parents absolutely did the best they could, but, where love might have transpired in a hug, we were typically, it came in the form of a credit card. And so I learned from a really early age that, love could be bought, and it was a transaction and had to be earned daily. We moved from Chicago when I was about 11, and we moved to southern Indiana. And, I remember just always feeling uncomfortable in my own skin from the very, very early age. I felt like, I've heard it said, like my skin suit was too tight. I felt like I didn't belong anywhere, and I would find myself trying to chameleon and fit in with whoever I was around. I just felt this intense self-hatred, and when I looked in the mirror, I hated the person looking back at me. I always say that alcoholism, that ism is so key, and it's key in my story because, I have to treat the ism daily. And so that obsession of the mind and the complete all or nothing started really young with me. In middle school, a kid walked up to me and said some not so kind words to me about my weight. I was going through a little bit of a phase, and it launched me into a 15-year intense eating disorder of just trying to feel okay. That, and I touch on that knowing this is Alcoholics Anonymous just because I was constantly searching for something or a circumstance outside of me to make me feel okay with who I was. So in high school, I danced and I competed at a very high level, and so if I wasn't in school, I was in a dance studio. I didn't get into drugs and alcohol, but I was, like I said, constantly searching for that relationship to make me okay, or for that validation from somewhere else. I was always looking externally. I took my first drink of alcohol at 19 years old. It was a double shot of vodka, and I was off to the races. I was a blackout drinker from the get-go. I remember drinking that night, and all of a sudden, our book talks about the I have arrived. And that was exactly how I felt. I felt that ease and comfort that came at once with that first drink. So I black out that night, and I remember waking up the next morning, and I was so sick, but I was not even thinking about the idea of why I was so sick. All I could focus on was the fact that everything was wonderful when I was drinking. I felt 10 feet tall and bulletproof. I didn't care what you thought of me. I didn't care who you were. I didn't care what I looked like. I didn't care what, was going on around me, because all of a sudden I had what, I'll later refer to as king alcohol. And I remember thinking at the bottom of, my friend's shower, sick as could be, I cannot wait to do that again. And immediately, pretty much from the get-go, I started justifying my drinking. I immediately started trying to fix my life around getting that next drink. At that time, I was working Monday through Friday at a job, and so, I was already thinking through, okay, it's Saturday, I can drink Saturday night and part of Sunday and be good for Monday. And our book talks about the part, where things tend to sometimes escalate quicker for women, and that was exactly my experience. So I took my first drink, and within 3 months, immediately I'm telling myself I'm only going to drink on the weekends. And within 3 months, my weekends are starting on Thursdays. And within 6 months, I'm an all-day, everyday drinker, hot vodka out of the back of my trunk. And, there's a part in our book where it's talking about drinking, and it says gradually things got worse. And that was exactly what my experience was as well. Consequences started to show up in my life from drinking, and they manifested themselves in different forms. And the earliest manifestation of the consequences in my life was, the loss of friendships. I would wake up the next day and people would remind me of things that I had done the night before that I had no recollection of, because, like I told you, I was a blackout drinker. But they didn't want anything to do with me. And so very quickly my friend group started to change, because it wasn't me, it was them. It wasn't that I had a problem with drinking, it was that they were no fun and they couldn't hang. I started to, lose jobs because they aren't a fan if you show up intoxicated on the job. And, I always would tell myself, as my drinking progressed, it's not that bad yet. People would, at the beginning, kind of point it out to me, but I would think to myself, well, I'm not drinking and driving. Then it'll be bad. It'll be bad if if I'm so obsessed with alcohol that I'm drinking behind the wheel. So at 19, I found myself pregnant. And I was in a relationship with a gentleman who was not very kind, physically or emotionally. And I told myself in that first trimester of my pregnancy, as I sat there and thought about it, I told myself, I can't raise a child with this person. I can't, look at how he treats me. How would he treat our child? What kind of father would he be to our child? The fact of the matter is I couldn't imagine going 9 months without alcohol. And then I couldn't imagine trying to raise a child and manage my drinking in the way that I wanted it to be. So at 10 weeks, I found myself in a clinic in Louisville, Kentucky, terminating a pregnancy. I couldn't even get through that operation without drinking. In the instructions, they tell you, obviously, you're going under anesthesia and not to drink. And that morning, I remember drinking, thinking, this is what I do all day, every day. And I remember waking up partway towards the end of the operation, and it was awful. When I left that clinic that day, I remember people were lining the streets, and they were, saying to me, you've committed an unforgivable sin. You're going to hell. And that really catapulted my drinking to a new level, as if I needed a reason to justify my drinking. I felt entitled because I felt so much shame and guilt from what I had done. So, like our book talks about as well, my drinking continued to take more serious proportions. And I continued to lose jobs and friendships. And that yet of not drinking and driving became an active part of my everyday life. It's by the grace of God that I didn't get a DUI yet, and I didn't commit vehicular homicide yet. And I say those yets to remind myself that I have a daily reprieve from alcoholism, contingent on my spiritual maintenance and working the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And there have been many times throughout my years in sobriety where I've seen people who quit working the program and their yet's become a reality. So I like to keep that in the forefront of my mind because I've heard that drinking tends to pick up where we left off. And I did wreck a lot of cars. I just, by the grace of God, didn't end up injuring anyone else in the process. So a year before I got sober, my parents started going to Al-Anon, and I had no idea what Al-Anon was, but they had been to a few meetings. And my parents almost loved me to death, literally, through alcoholism. You know, I didn't pay my rent, they'd show up with the checkbook. I wrecked a car, they'd get me a new one. I think that they didn't understand how to love me with me actively drinking, so they thought that if they could just help my circumstances, the same way I thought if I could manage the things around me, that everything would be okay. Finally, my parents came to me and said, you know, like, we're not gonna do this anymore. And my mom invited me to go to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I had zero experience with AA. I was adopted out of a home where there was drug and alcohol addiction, but my adoptive parents, I don't think I ever saw them drink a day in their lives. And, you know, I asked my mom, I said, do I have to be sober in order to go to this meeting? And she said, no, all you need is a desire to stop drinking. And I had zero desire to stop drinking, but I had a desire for her to pay my rent that month. And it was the second, and I had $0 in my bank account. I didn't have a bank account, no. I just had $0. I was not that together. And so I agreed to go to this meeting of AA with her. And she picks me up, and I show up to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous in Louisville, Kentucky with a water bottle full of vodka and halfway intoxicated. I thought that no one in that meeting would know what was in that water bottle, and I thought that, you know, I would just get through this meeting, go home, and I had appeased my parents, and maybe they would cut me a check. I don't remember a ton from that first meeting, but there are a few things that stood out to me. All those people in that room were sharing, and it ended up being a first step meeting, which is very shocking. And they talked about how they used to drink, and in their 3-minute share, they talked about how they used to drink, but then they talked about how life was now, and how they didn't drink, and how life had gotten better, and that was the consistent message that I kept hearing across the board. And I'd hear them talk in the beginning of their share about these awful, embarrassing things that they had done. Things that I had done, but I wasn't admitting to a room full of people, and I was baffled at the fact. But I also was looking at them thinking, they did these awful things, and every single person in this room looks like they've showered in the last week, which was more than I had done myself. And after the meeting, a guy came up to me, and I had gone to high school with this guy, immediately recognized him. And he's still in the program to this day. And his name was Jake. And Jake walked up to me, and Jake was that guy in high school where when the drug-sniffing dogs would come to school, straight to Jake's locker. Like, they did not deviate. It was just straight to Jake's locker. And Jake, he looked like he was a little together. And he came up to me, and I had cried through my entire first meeting. And he said to me, Tiffany, I'm so happy to see you here. And I thought to myself, this is why I don't come to AA. How embarrassing that he's seeing me all crying in a mess. This is humiliating. And the last thing that I remember from that meeting is a woman walked up to me. And she looked at me, and I hadn't shared in that meeting, so I wasn't sure at that moment how she knew that I was intoxicated. But she came up to me and she said, if you ever get tired of drinking, there's a different way to live, and you never have to drink again. And she handed me her phone number, and she asked that I call her. I never called that woman, but what happened in that moment was she planted the seed of AA in my life. Because for the next 6 weeks, I continued to drink, isolated and alone. And like our book talks about, liquor ceased to be a luxury for me. It became a necessity. I had the physical ailments of alcoholism. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my throat swelling. I would be, I couldn't get through moments of the day without my hand shaking. I would start sentences only for my throat to swell, and I couldn't even finish the words, and my body was physically shutting down. I would look in the mirror in the morning and pick up my pint of vodka, and I knew I had to drink, but I knew I was never going to be able to get as drunk to escape the chaos in my head. I'd prayed a lot of foxhole prayers in my life, and even in my drinking. God, please help me find my keys so I can get to work on time. God, I swear, if the liquor store stays open 5 minutes late because I'm running late from this shift, I won't drink on the way home. And at my very lowest bottom, I remember crying out and taking, my bottom looked a lot like sitting there with a handgun and deciding whether I was going to end my life or pick up the phone. And what rang in my head was that lady's voice saying, you don't have to drink again. And my parents had told me, don't call us for money, don't call us for anything unless you want to get help. And I picked up the phone and I called my parents, and I don't really remember, but my mom said I said something like, I'm ready. And 24 hours later, I was being checked into Cumberland Heights, where I did 28 days of inpatient treatment. I was introduced to the idea of alcoholism for the first time on a deeper level than just one meeting and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and they handed me this blue book. I didn't think I was an alcoholic. I didn't think I qualified. I didn't really know what an alcoholic was, but I know that what I'd seen in movies was a homeless man under a bridge with a pint of, or a bottle of something, and that wasn't me. I hadn't been arrested. I thought that was a prerequisite to being in AA. I had some consequences, but when I would hear people share, even in treatment, I'd think, wow, you're so much worse off than me. My counselor encouraged me while I was in there to start reading the stories in the back of the book of AA, because I couldn't sleep at night. She asked me how I was sleeping. I said, not very good, because I used to use alcohol to get to sleep. And so I didn't have that. I had nothing. So she said, why don't you read the stories in the back of the book and see if you can find any similarities and relate. And in the beginning, when I was shut off to the idea of alcoholism, I would open up the book and I would flip to one of the stories and it would read something like, I was a middle-aged black man. And I was like, well, can't relate to that, so I'm not an alcoholic, because I didn't want to see the similarities. And as I stayed in treatment for the next couple weeks, we went to a few outside meetings, and I started hearing people talk about the restless, irritable, and discontented feeling that they felt when they weren't drinking alcohol. I heard them talk about that feeling that I so related to my entire life, of my skin suit being far too tight and feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. When I was getting ready to leave treatment, my counselor called me into her office a few days before, and she said, you're wrapping up your 28 days. What's your plan? And I looked at her and I said, so there's this guy. And she said no. And she encouraged that I go live in a sober living house, because even at 28 days sober, or 26 days at that time, I still had, I was stark raving crazy. I literally had, my best idea was to go back to a relationship, thinking that would fix me yet again. I was encouraged to stay away from old people, places, and playgrounds, and she suggested that I go live in a sober living house in Nashville. She told me I'd be living with 16 other women, and that did not sound enjoyable to me at the time, but she gave me a number and got me hooked up with a halfway house in East Nashville. And when I left treatment 2 days later, my parents picked me up, and I remember driving to East Nashville from Cumberland Heights. And 20 minutes into our drive, I look up and I see a billboard for Budweiser, and I was furious. I could not believe that the city of Nashville had put up a billboard with Budweiser when I was trying to get sober. Because that's how egotistical and self-centered I was, that's that selfishness and self-centered of how dare they. Don't they know there's a treatment center 20 minutes away? And so I get to the halfway house that day, and I'm very overwhelmed. And my roommate, she was my roommate in treatment too. And it was a blessing that we got to, continue our friendship, and we're still friends to this day. But she's very bubbly, and she was very excited to show me around the halfway house and introduce me to everyone. And all I felt was extremely overwhelmed and scared, because on the way there, from the moment we took the exit off Gallatin Pike, I had counted 7 gas stations and 3 liquor stores on the way to that halfway house. And I knew that when I was cooped up in treatment that I didn't really have access to alcohol, but the minute I was out in the real world, reality hit, and I realized that I hadn't been able to go 2 hours without alcohol, or 30 minutes. How was I supposed to live daily and not pick up a drink when I had to walk to the bus stop on the corner that shared the corner with 3 gas stations around me? And I remember the words of my counselor in treatment. She said, go to a meeting in your first 24 hours, go to a meeting, go to a meeting, go to a meeting. And so I cut Ashley off halfway through what she was telling me, and I said, I need to go to a meeting of AA. And I didn't have a car because my license was revoked the first 2 years of my sobriety due to not paying my car insurance. I wasn't a fan of paying bills when I was drinking. All of my money went towards booze. So the state of Indiana revoked my driver's license. So she offered to drive me to a meeting. And she said, I know of a meeting. There's one tomorrow morning at 10:30. My dad goes there. And that very next morning, she took me to my first outside meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and it was the backroom group at 5925. That's still my home group today. And I walked into that meeting, and I sat in between two old-timer guys. And immediately they looked at me, and they were like, do you have a sponsor? And I said, no, I just got out of treatment 24 hours ago. And they yell across the room to a lady who is now my sponsor. They said, Tracy, we got a fresh one for you. And she popped up so fast and turned around and waved at me and came over to introduce herself. And I always say that I was God-appointed as sponsor because left to my own devices, I would have been slothful in the action of finding a sponsor. I would have, because of fear of getting into the work and the God word that I saw on the wall, I would have sat and slowly died in a chair of AA without sponsorship. Because my idea of a sponsor was someone who was going to co-sign my bullshit, or possibly just a male that was going to let me do whatever I wanted. So when Tracy walked over to me, she hands me her phone number, and she says, call me tonight at 8 o'clock. And I walked around that halfway house all day and bugged every single woman there because I didn't understand why this woman wanted me to call her, and I wasn't sure that I actually was going to. So 8 o'clock rolls around, and I pick up that 1,000-pound phone, and I call this woman. I had no idea what I was going to say. And her voice answered on the other end, and I said, hi, Tracy, it's Tiffany, and we met this morning. And the beauty of AA is she took it from there. She said, hi, Tiffany, I'm so glad that you called. Are you wanting to work a program of action? Because if you do, I have one that carries depth and weight. And she asked me to do a few simple things until we could meet in person a few days later. She asked me to get on my knees in the morning and at night and pray to a God of my understanding to keep me clean and sober for that day. She asked me to go to a meeting until I saw her, and we would outline the rest of how we were going to go about our day-to-day activities. And she also asked me to start reading pages 86 through 88 in the big book in the morning and at night. She told me not to drink, not to die, and not to kill any of the women that I was living with at the time, because when we got on the phone, she asked me how my day was going, and I was very offended that someone hadn't done their chore in the house and that it was reflecting poorly on my bedtime. So I met with Tracy a few days later, and we sat down with both of our big books between us. And she asked me, she said, is this the last house on the block for you? And I thought about it for a second. This was the first time in my life that I was actually out of ideas. I felt like throughout my life I was always just trying to survive, like a dog paddling, trying to keep your head above water. Alcohol had me licked. I could not figure it out. There was no managing it. I knew that I was literally a prisoner to alcohol and that I didn't have a choice to drink anymore. So I told her, this is the last house on the block, and her face lit up. She said, that's great. And I get that now, having sponsored women and taken them through the 12 steps of AA. She asked me if I was willing to do a few simple things. She said, are you willing to go to a meeting for at least the next 90 days? And I said, yes. She asked me if I was willing to set aside other things in my life and make working the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous a priority. I said, yeah. She asked me if I was willing to stay out of a relationship for the first year of my sobriety so that I could focus on working the 12 steps of AA. And that was the one I wanted to argue on. But she kindly reminded me, and very quickly, that I had nothing to offer in a relationship and that it might deviate from me actually being able to put all of my effort and energy into the steps. So I reluctantly said yes. So we get into the big book of AA, and she told me that as long as this book was between us, she was carrying me the message of AA. And if we deviated from it, she was carrying the message of Tracy and not the message of Alcoholics Anonymous. And she said the same thing to me that that lady said at that first meeting I attended, that if I don't want to drink and I don't want to die, that there's a solution in the rooms of AA. So we get into the steps. Step 1, am I powerless over alcohol, and has my life become unmanageable? You know, I remember in Cumberland Heights, they had me write all of my consequences on the board and my correlation with alcohol and how quickly those stints were in between. So step 1, I was pretty willing to admit it because I was out of solutions and ideas. Because my best idea at 22 years old was no longer being on this earth. So I was desperate for some help. So step 1, yes, absolutely. Then we get into step 2. Came to believe the power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. I struggle with that God word on the wall, and I hear that a lot in meetings. I'm so grateful that I had a sponsor and that we were in the book of AA because she reminded me that it was a God of my understanding. And the God that I was raised with seemed to be a punishing and not forgiving God. And she told me that it only took, like the book said, a mustard seed of faith, and that if I was willing to cultivate that relationship. And I was grateful that it said the mustard seed because that was about all I had at that time. I remember doing step 3 with her at her apartment. It was me and her on her knees, and we did that 3rd step prayer, turning our will and our lives over the care of God as we understood him. And when we got up from that 3rd step prayer, she picked up the book yet again, and she said, now into the 4th step. And I just started crying. I was so terrified of working the 4th step of Alcoholics Anonymous. I had heard so much stigma, and so it was the boogeyman of all steps in my world. And I couldn't imagine writing a personal inventory. She told me that we were going to set a deadline that day, and we did. She said, this isn't a step that we're going to sit on. This isn't something that we're going to sit there and cogitate on. We want to get through it. And when I started to reluctantly not want to do this step, she reminded me that I had, at the beginning, agreed to go to any lengths to have victory over alcohol. And that included a fearless and searching moral inventory of myself. She told me that we were going to go back through all areas of my life and that nothing but thoroughness counted. And so for the next 4 weeks, I went back through every area of my life, the way the book outlines it. And on that day that we set, I met at her house, and we did the 5th step. And when I sat down to do that 5th step, I was extremely nervous and terrified. And she told me, she said, okay, let's start with the first person on your list. And I start reading it. And she stops me. And she said, no, let's start with the one thing that you showed up here not to tell me today. And that was the first thing on my 5th step that I ended up going through with her. And I'll later get to the fact that that was the first amends that I actually made. As I went through the 5th step with her, where I thought there was going to be judgment and humiliation and lack of understanding, I was met with grace and her sharing some of her 5th step with me. Nothing on that 5th step seemed to impress her or alarm her at all. And at the end of it, she did the craziest thing, but it's exactly what was said in the book. She got up, got her purse, got her keys, and left me in her apartment because we had just read the part of the book where it says, now we sit for an hour. And I sat there, me and her golden retriever, and I was literally terrified to move. I was like, I don't know why this woman just left me here. But that's how much my sponsor believes in the book of AA and coming straight from the book, and I'm so, so grateful for that. She came back after an hour, and she went through those questions, and she said, is there any stone that we've left unturned? Is there something that you need to divulge? Is there anything that you've left out of this inventory? And I could honestly say no. And I felt completely gutted from the inside out, and I was exhausted. Then we got into steps 6 and 7, talking about removing character defects and preparing ourselves for that. And then we started with step 8, making that list out, because in step 5, we looked at my part in things. So then it was time for me to start making those categories for making my amends. We did it just like it was outlined in the book, and we went through all the people in there. And I had a list for immediate, sometimes, and never. And then we started writing out the amends. And when it comes to the 9th step, I'm really grateful that it was pointed out to me through sponsorship that I should do these steps in order, because when I first got sober, I really wanted to run to a lot of people and make amends. Because I didn't really want to make amends to you. I just wanted to go on an ego trip and show you how good I was doing and show you that I wasn't drinking anymore and maybe throw an "I'm sorry" in there and hope that you would pat me on the back. So I'm grateful that my sponsor asked me to wait until the 9th step and not go and make any of those amends. It's pointed out in the 9th step very clearly in the book that we don't cause any more harm, and it's very clear cut. So my sponsor and I sat down and wrote out my first amends, and she sent me home, and I went to go make that amends. She asked me to get on a bus and go to the first cemetery that I came to. And when I did, I got off that bus with that handwritten amends, and she told me to find a child's grave for less than a year. And I went and sat in front of that child's grave, and I made an amends to that unborn child. And that was extremely powerful for me. As I went through the rest of my immediate amends, I did a lot of amends to my family members, usually the people closest to me. Part of my responsibility as a recovering alcoholic is sometimes what is called a living amends that my sponsor taught me of. And that, that's come in many forms in my sobriety. My grandmother really liked to eat steak. She was a little German woman. And she split her time living in our Florida beach house half of the year and then coming and living with my parents for half of the year. And she asked me on Wednesdays to go get steak with her at her favorite restaurant. And in my years that I was drinking, I would show up every Wednesday at 11 a.m., halfway loaded and shuffling vodka bottles from the front seat to the back seat and throwing a jacket over them to pick up my grandmother and take her to get steak. I was never present for any of those lunches. And when I made my amends to her, she didn't really understand the program of AA. But when I spoke with my sponsor later, she said, "Your responsibility as a living amends is to be present with this woman." And so for 9 beautiful years, I had the privilege of being present with that woman at every holiday, at every dinner. And when she took her last breath 6 months ago, I was there to hold her hand and be present in that moment as well. That's a privilege and an honor to be able to suit up and show up in people's lives today on that level. Step 10 talks about doing a daily personal inventory of our actions throughout the day. My sponsor had me start that 86 through 88 early on, and I didn't understand that, when we retire at night, that's exactly what that was going to be. That was going to be my 10th step, looking at my part in the day. Do I owe amends to someone? Do I need to go back and right some wrongs? Do I have a resentment that I need to pray for someone? Step 11 sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understand Him. I prayed in the beginning of AA when I first got sober because my sponsor suggested it to me and I was afraid of picking up a drink. And as I cultivated that relationship, I seemed to, in the very early years, leave off the idea of meditation. I struggled with being able to quiet my mind or sit there. And it was pointed out to me a few years into my sobriety that meditation, prayer is first talking to your higher power, and meditation is to listen. And so over the years, I've been able to cultivate the practice of meditation, but it's definitely been a process for me. Today, it's a daily part of my morning routine and sometimes my evening routine, and it helps me to center my day. And then step 12, carry the message of Alcoholics. Carried the message of Alcoholics Anonymous to other recovering alcoholics. I remember reading that part in the book with my sponsor, and it talked about how that was going to be the bright spot of our lives. And I remember even in that moment kind of laughing at it and thinking, sitting down with this book is not going to ever be the bright spot of my life with another woman. And I can honestly say today that watching the light come on in a woman's eyes and watching their families be restored or them be able to redouble their efforts in their sobriety and be able to work through some stuff that they've been holding on to is absolutely the bright spot of my life. My sponsor also pointed out that working that 12-step doesn't always come in the form of sponsorship, and very early on, she got me involved in service. At 3 months sober, I was at my first business meeting. She did not have me go prior to that. She said they might be a little intense. So at 3 months sober, I show up at my first business meeting, and they needed a greeter. And my sponsor kindly voluntold me that that was going to be my service position for the next year. And so for the next year of my sobriety, I stood at the front of back room. It's a pretty big meeting if you've been. And I looked at everyone at 10 a.m. to 10:30, and I said, "Hi, welcome, I'm glad you're here." I was terrified of this. When I was drinking, I was 10 feet tall and bulletproof, but when you took my armor away from me, when I didn't have that shield protecting me from you, and you actually saw straight through me, I was absolutely terrified. This got me involved in service, and it also got me to meet other people of my home group. And in that first year of sobriety, I remember my sponsor sitting down and asking me, she said, do you have any stipulations around AA? Do you think there's anything that would be justifiable for you to go out and drink? And after I put some thought into it, I came back to her and I came back with 3 things. And I can tell you that in my first year of sobriety, all 3 of those things happened. At 4 months sober, I got home from a meeting, and I went to those meetings where every month they have a chip, because I needed you guys to clap for me every month. And I had just picked up my 4-month chip, and I got back to the halfway house, and my phone rang. And it was my biological sister on the other end of the line. She said, "Our biological mom is dying of cirrhosis of the liver, and she wants to talk to you one last time." Hadn't spoken to this woman basically my whole life, because when I was taken out of the home by DCS, I have no recollection of that relationship. But what she said to me on the phone, my whole life I had planned what I was going to say to this woman, all the abandonment and trauma I felt like she had given me. And when I got on the phone that day, I was able to suit up and show up and just be quiet. And what she said to me on that phone was, "I love you and don't walk down the same path as me." She had no idea that I was in recovery. She had no idea that I had struggled with this disease, and she passed away that evening. Sobriety has given me a lot of opportunities, and I was encouraged very early on to stay in the middle of the boat in AA. I'm grateful that the home group that I go to, there's several people here from my home group. When I showed up, I kept hearing the terms AA in action. And there are several members. When I picked up my chip this year at my home group, I counted 9, and I know there's more. But they're people that I've seen working the program of AA since I got there and continuing to take the daily actions. I was reminded that I don't recover from alcoholism. I have a daily reprieve contingent on the spiritual maintenance of my program. It's a privilege to suit up and show up in various aspects of my life today, and I don't take it for granted. I have 4 biological siblings. I was adopted with one, another one was adopted into another family, and 2 of them I had never met. Last week, I met my brother for the first time, and that was a big deal for me. Our biological mom is in the grave, and my biological father is serving a life sentence at a state penitentiary in California. And then they have a sister who's been sober in AA. So they get to see where this disease can take us, and they're all genetically predisposed to this. I get to be a wife today. I get to be a partner in life. I get to be a mom, a sober mom. That's a big deal for me. Because after what I did, that unforgivable sin that I was told would never be forgiven, the God of my understanding trusted me with 2 more beautiful girls. It's a privilege to show up as an employee today in my job. But it was also pointed out to me that I can make anything my higher power in the sense of getting addicted to other things, whether it's working out, a job, and that anything I put before my recovery, I'm going to lose. Been told to stay at the epicenter of AA and to put it in the forefront. And I'm so grateful for the life that AA has given me. There's a guy at my home group, he always says Don't let your years interfere with your days. And sometimes the more years I get in sobriety, the harder it is for me to recall what that last drink looked like. And that's why it's imperative that frequent contact with newcomers is in my life. I need to be with people who have 30, 60, 90 days sober. And I get more emotional watching people pick up chips for a year than I do for 20 years. It's a big deal, and it's tough. I've also seen people at the other end of the spectrum, having been around the rooms for a little over 9 years now. I've seen people who quit working the program and just disappear, or they decide to do what our book says and take the ultimate sacrifice. If I want to remain happy, joyous, and free, I realize that the alcohol is my solution. I always thought that that was my problem. I thought I was going to show up and you guys were going to teach me to put the plug in the jug and things were going to be great. And I realized that that restless, irritable, and discontented feeling will come back if I'm not taking the daily actions, just like a cancer patient taking their daily medicine or getting chemotherapy. There have been points in my sobriety where I've been dry. There have been points in my sobriety where I felt like taking the ultimate sacrifice would have even been easier than redoubling my efforts in the program of AA. And that just shows me that I'm not cured of this and that I have a spiritual malady. I thought that, I was always trying to fill that God-sized hole with something else. I talked about my eating disorder early on, and then, from food to men to whatever I was trying to fill it with. And it really was a spiritual malady that I had. I'm so grateful to be able to participate in my sobriety today and to sponsor women and take them through the steps of AA. And I'm grateful to be here with you guys tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. That was amazing. I knew we had a lot in common, but God, there's so many parts of your story that we have identical. Okay, well, thank you for everybody for being here. We're going to circle up, end the meeting with the Lord's Prayer for anyone who cares to join us.